Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor for me to address you at today's conference on international cooperation on counter-terrorism. Mr. David, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I thank the ICT for giving me, as a representative of the Netherlands, the opportunity to share some observations with you on counter-terrorism. The friendship between the Netherlands and Israel, I say friendship, not partnership, goes back decades. And these days, my current boss, the Netherlands Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Rosenthal, is a good friend and a staunch ally of Israel. Ladies and gentlemen, it's late in the day, evening approaching, so I could try to keep your attention as one of the last speakers by saying a few outrageous things. That would be fun for once. But I'm sorry to disappoint you, I won't. I will start with some general views on international terrorism. Then I will focus on how to confront the terrorist threat at the national and the international level. And under international cooperation, I will highlight the EU and UN level of action, as well as the need for continued effort in capacity building. Finally, I will come to some concluding remarks on our future international agenda. When 70 million people around the globe, including myself and perhaps some of you here participating in the conference, were watching the World Cup soccer final a year ago, terrorists detonated bombs in Kampala, killing 74 football fans. Innocent people just wanting to enjoy a relaxing evening became victims of a brutal terrorist attack by jihadists who claim to serve Islam, but in fact killed the people who they say to protect. But the threat of terrorism doesn't solely stem from jihadist movements like Al-Qaeda. Of course, the burning and collapsing of the World Trade Center towers forever symbolize Al-Qaeda terrorism, but what happened in Norway on July 22nd made it painfully clear that terrorism is not the exclusive domain of extremist Muslims. Numerous attacks in the past decade speak volumes. As for Al-Qaeda, this organization, or the broader extremist jihadi movement if you prefer, has been dealt significant blows recently. Some speakers today already have spoken about that. The death of Al-Qaeda's leader Osama bin Laden stands out in this respect. But the way in which the mass protests in the Arab world started, with calls for more democracy, freedoms, social and socio-economic rights, has refuted the violent ideology propagated by Al-Qaeda in a more fundamental way. This is not to say that there are no security risks tied to the recent developments in the Arab world. What I say is that in the battle of ideas, as the previous speaker said, the violent ideology of Al-Qaeda has been dealt a firm blow by the demonstrations in the Arab world, in particular in Egypt and Tunisia. All the same, terrorism continues to be one of the biggest and most challenging threats facing the world today. Therefore, states must remain determined to defend themselves against international terrorism, together and from their own strength, at the national and at the international level. Zooming in on the national level, I will take the example I know best, my own home country. Or in other words, how does the Netherlands counter terrorism? Counter-terrorism in the Netherlands involves a wide range of political, administrative, financial, legal and disruptive instruments to be deployed separately or in combination. In sync with this basic assumption, the national counter-terrorism strategy in the Netherlands is based upon a wide-range approach translated into five pillars: the acquisition of information, the prevention of attacks and violent extremism, the defense of vital objects, agencies and persons, being prepared for a possible attack and its consequences, and the prosecution of suspects with terrorist motives. A wide-range approach also implies that terrorism cannot be dealt with as an isolated phenomenon. Major elements of counterterrorism are the identification and, if necessary, monitoring of radical cells and networks, as well as the prevention of radicalization and issuing a timely alert against this phenomenon. Lately, the threat of homegrown terrorism has diminished significantly in the Netherlands, which is different from what we heard about other countries. In the Dutch setup, a national coordinator responsible for counterterrorism and national security has been designated with the crucial task of bringing all players together in a coordinated response. To name just a few, the Ministry of the Interior and Kingdom Relations, the Ministry of Security and Justice, the Public Prosecutor's Department, the National Police Agency, and the General and Defense Intelligence and Security Services. My boss, Minister of Foreign Affairs Rosenthal, is responsible for the proper implementation of sanctions. He takes the decision to place a person or organization on the national terrorism list, thus freezing their assets. The timing and execution of this measure is yet another domain in need of close coordination by more or less the same actors I mentioned a moment ago. All these agencies work closely together on a sanctions list. With this wide-range approach and a multitude of stakeholders, that comes with a risk, and that risk is a lack of focus. This is why the Dutch government developed a new counterterrorism strategy for the period 2011-2015. The strategy stresses the need to continue the broad approach, but also identifies a set of specific priorities. A continued sharp focus on international jihadism as the main terrorist threat against the Netherlands, measures to reduce risks of migration and travel movements, in particular the tendency of youngsters, Muslims, to travel to the jihadist battlefields is a concern for my government. The third priority is technological innovation, and the fourth is further development of the surveillance and security systems. These are the four main strategic choices that the Cabinet will make in the coming 5 years in counterterrorism policy and operations. Does all this imply the authorities can exclude the possibility of a terrorist act from occurring on Dutch soil? Certainly not. The notion that no society is free from this risk is, in fact, embedded in the strategy. One of the 5 pillars of our counterterrorism strategy specifically focuses on the need to enhance the resilience in Dutch society in the event of a terrorist attack. The strong show of solidarity and the unity of the public and the authorities in the aftermath of the horrifying terrorist attacks in Norway is a source of inspiration for being resilient. However important a sound and effective national counterterrorism strategy may be, no democratic state can defend itself against international terrorism in isolation. International cooperation is a must and features prominently, if not dominantly, across the priorities of the Dutch counterterrorism policy. This brings me to the issue of international cooperation in counterterrorism. It will not come as a surprise to this audience that cooperation within the framework of the European Union plays a major role in our everyday efforts to counter terrorism. Over the years, the EU and its member states have improved their ability to use the criminal law approach against terrorism and taken measures to fight terrorism while avoiding that it can inadvertently be used as recruitment and propaganda tools by terrorists. The EU has always been careful to avoid giving terrorists the false glamour of being warriors for a cause. After 9/11, the EU adopted a series of measures to enhance its ability to prevent and fight terrorism. The EU legal definition of terrorism was strengthened to include recruitment and public provocation, terrorist training and membership of a terrorist organization. In 2004, the European Council created the post of an EU counter-terrorism coordinator, and in 2005, the European Council adopted the EU counter-terrorism strategy, which was followed by separate strategies on radicalization and recruitment, terrorist financing, and media communication. These days, real-time operational cross-border cooperation of police and prosecutors is facilitated by Europol and Eurojust. The response to the Oslo attacks has included the first use of Europol's first responders network. Disrupting plots and preventing attacks requires the collection and sharing of relevant data, while respecting the right to privacy of our citizens. The EU has adopted a number of instruments which allow data collection and data sharing among EU member states and with third countries, while respecting high standards of data protection. The EU is active in promoting common rules on terrorist financing, in particular in the FATF. The EU-US terrorist financing tracking program is a useful operational tool to detect and disrupt terrorist plots. Clearly, all these actions, and I've not been able to mention them all, well decided at the EU level, predominantly depend on the ability and willingness of all member states to put them into practice. The Netherlands, for its part, has always strived for a swift transposition of new EU legislation and has often been one of the catalysts of strengthened cooperation. The intensive work done at the EU and at the national level is, in turn, inspired by the standards and norms as well as the legal framework set at the UN level. The UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy and the comprehensive approach that it embodies is a key point of reference. The full implementation of all UN Security Council resolutions, UN conventions and protocols relating to terrorism is for us a matter of high priority. The UN Counter-Terrorism Strategy expanded the global counter-terrorism framework to include not only security measures, but also measures to ensure respect for human rights and to address underlying conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism. These include, among other things, prolonged unresolved conflicts, lack of rule of law, violations of human rights, and social, economic, and political marginalization. The UN strategy is a complete set of measures which should be implemented in their totality to develop balanced responses to terrorism in member states of the UN. The UN norms and values also guide Dutch efforts in support of other countries seeking to improve their capacities to prevent terrorism. Recognizing the importance of prevention, the Netherlands supports actions and programs in third countries at preventing or interrupting at an early stage the process of radicalization leading to terrorism. This is best done at the level closest to the most susceptible individuals in the most vulnerable communities. By working on peace building, conflict prevention and state building, the Dutch government intends to contribute to the prevention of terrorism and radicalization. For example, the Dutch government has reserved significant funds in support of countries in the Arab region. By supporting the positive forces of change and through the promotion of democratic values, the rule of law, and helping in the modernization of their economies, we hope to minimize the space for spoilers to exploit the uncertain and varying stages of transition in which these countries find themselves. Clearly, the Dutch support has to be, and I'm pleased to say, is part of a much bigger international effort in the same line of thinking. In addition to these broader development objectives, the Dutch government will continue to seek opportunities to support activities that are specifically geared to prevent terrorism. The Netherlands financially supports projects that counter radicalization and violent extremism, prevent terrorist financing, improve airport security, border controls, and enhances the inclusiveness of government counter-terrorism strategies and policies. We do this in countries that themselves are intensely confronted with radicalization, extremism, and terrorism. The range of countries is varied: Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, Indonesia, to name a few, as well as a broader regional program focusing on the African continent. Over the last few weeks, looking back to 10 years of counterterrorism, questions dominating the political and media debates have typically been: are we safer? What has a decade of counterterrorism brought us? I can give you the Netherlands perspective on this. As I stated from the outset, terrorism continues to pose a threat to peace and security. At the same time, I firmly believe it is a threat that the international community is better equipped to deal with now than we were 10 years ago. And it has not grown into the existential threat that people feared it would become in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. Thanks to the comprehensive actions that have been undertaken by the international community over the past decade, both domestically and internationally, Al-Qaeda is now more marginalized than ever. It is its affiliates in Yemen, the Maghreb, it is Al-Shabaab in Somalia that we need to be alert on. Governments continue to work together to implement international measures such as UN Security Council resolutions, FATF special recommendations, and other international instruments. These measures make it more difficult for terrorists to plan, finance, and execute attacks throughout the world. However, how well equipped we are, individual countries, and the international community because of intense cooperation, there's always the chance, perhaps the probability, that new terrorist attacks will take place. These terrorist attacks are designed to undermine our core principles: freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. We believe that the best way to protect our way of life is to observe these principles, including in how we deal with terrorism and terrorists. Let me underline that there is reason nor time for complacency, not least because more and more signals point that terrorists and terrorist organizations are branching out into other dark arts. We face increased cooperation between terrorist groups and criminals in North and West Africa: drugs, weapons, and kidnapping. In Somalia, terrorists and pirates are likely to find themselves through a shared interest in chaos. Along the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, terrorist operations are financed with the proceeds of drugs trafficking. These criminal entrepreneurs affect the lives of people far beyond the regions where they operate. Preventing these interlinkages from developing further and pursuing them where they are already in play is part of our future agenda. These interlinkages should be analyzed and discussed further and be an item on the international agenda to fight terrorism. Thank you very much for your attention.